Okay guys, if you have a used engine that you've bought and you want to get ready to fire it up and you want to actually do a little prep on the engine stand before you fire it up, there's a couple things you got to think about. One of the things is if you have the intake manifold removed and those ports have been opened, even if it has tape over it, and this one actually used packaging tape, guys, so there's a bunch of like sticky residue from that packaging tape attached to it. Don't ever use packaging tape. That's a horrible solution for tape. Don't ever use duct tape or packaging tape. Use painter's tape, guys. Painter's tape is the only thing that's really a good idea for no residue left behind on that cylinder head surface. But I digress. You also want to think about the ports right here. If you have a used engine, there's always going to be debris and stuff that's gotten into these ports. And the best way I've found to deal with that is to get a product that looks like this, the intake valve and turbo cleaner. CRC is the brand for this one. Put the engine rotated 90 degrees as you see right here. That way you can actually take this cleaner and you can spray it up into this port right here. And that intake port drains with gravity downwards. So when you spray up in here, I'll show you guys right now real fast. Basically, everything that's in that port that gets sprayed in there is gonna drain back down into the little trough below. And you can see all the different shit that actually came out of it. This is a clean trough to start with. And I sprayed it in there, and there's a bunch of gunk in there, some carbon buildup and stuff, but you know, other debris that just kind of got in there while this engine was stored over all the years. Who knows how long this JDM engine has been stored in here. Spray a little bit more on that side too. And this of course gets on that little baffle kind of thing for your oil PCV system. Nevertheless, that's the first thing. Get all this debris that actually got inside these little ports on your intake ports, because you don't actually want to turn your engine over and have it turning over with a starter if you're going to start it on the stand like I'm going to do. You don't want to do that with a bunch of shit on that intake port. It's going to suck it right into that combustion chamber. It's going to scratch up the combustion walls and the cylinder rings. And if there's any hard debris, it could actually damage one of the rings or your ring lands. So definitely a bad idea. Get all the shit out of there. You can also vacuum it out of there, but I actually like using this little method right here and just spraying it and letting the gravity drain it all out. And then I'll actually stick a clean rag in there and try to clean it really well with a clean rag as well, a little microfiber rag. So that's the first thing, guys. Clean out those intake ports. And then the second thing is the oil, guys. You definitely want to drain that oil. If you bought a used engine from somebody online, on Facebook Marketplace, or a JDM engine from one of those importers, drain all your oil first. I drained my oil, and my oil was actually pretty gunky and old, so I'm definitely going to be putting in fresh oil. And what I recommend is actually putting fresh oil in and actually circulating it a couple times with that fresh oil, and then draining that fresh oil. So that's the second thing, guys. Definitely check the oil. Next thing is to add a little bit of oil. Doesn't really matter what kind of oil, because this is just to flush the system. I'm gonna add this oil because when you turn this engine over, even on the engine stand, you're actually gonna be sucking up oil in that oil pan. So you wanna have fresh oil in that oil pan. That way the oil pickup that sucks that oil up and pumps that oil through all the oil passages of this engine is sucking up clean oil, or at least the cleanest oil we can get initially. So this engine is a JDM engine. It could have been sitting for years and years and years. Who knows how long it's been sitting. So I want to basically flush all the systems as much as I can before I put this engine in the car. So basically I'm going to put oil in it. I'm going to turn it over on the engine stand with a starter and a battery. That will flush the oil system. Then I'm also going to use a little pump and an external reservoir to flush coolant through the system. And like you guys saw earlier, I also used intake valve cleaner to clean out those intake passages in the backside of those intake valves. That way this engine is clean as I can get it, and I can run a compression test on it after I've cleaned all the passages up and I've put fresh oil in it. That's the last step I'm going to do with this engine, is to verify that it has decent compression in all 4 cylinders. Okay guys, and the next step will be to get a spacer and bolt the starter onto the back of the engine. Now to mount the starter to your engine on an engine stand, you're actually going to have to modify a traditional engine stand right here on the corner. This is just a standard Harbor Freight engine stand, and most engine stands are going to require a slight little modification to the corner right here. And basically all you need to do is take in about an inch deep little triangle. So just take out a little triangle that's about an inch into that material, and there's still plenty of material right here. This is thick, solid steel. So you still be able to retain this mounting point for the engine stand. You can have 4 mounting points still, but you're definitely gonna have to notch this little corner out. That way the starter can slide right in right here. All right guys, I ended up cutting a little bit bigger wedge off this engine mount. You can kind of see right there, there's still plenty of material left in that little slot. So we're still good to go, but take a look at the size of this wedge right now. That's basically the size I needed to give it plenty of clearance for that starter. So now that we've cleared that little wedge off, I can actually install the starter. But there's one thing you need to realize, that starter can't just sit against this engine block. The starter actually bolts to the transmission housing. That transmission housing spaces that starter back about 50 millimeters. So if you're gonna use the starter on your engine stand, you actually have to use a 50 millimeter spacer to space that starter back. That way that little wheel in that starter that kicks out to turn this flywheel is actually aligned at the right distance. And that's actually what I have right here. This is actually a 3D printed little spacer that's the perfect size, the perfect dimensions, and a perfect bolt spacing to space that starter back about 50 millimeters. I gotta give props to my buddy Dave out in Fremont. He's the one that printed this 3D spacer. He's the one that actually gave me that file that I'll include in the description below. So thanks a lot, Dave, for this 3D printed spacer and the files that we're sharing with everybody. Really appreciate it, buddy. And of course, in addition to that spacer, you also need some starter bolts. But the standard bolts that you use on your engine, they actually go through your transmission bell housing and into the engine block. Those bolts are the perfect length, of course, because the spacer is actually simulating the same distance that that transmission bell housing puts the starter at. Here's a setup for that starter. I've got that spacer, that has to be 50 millimeters exactly. But as you'll see, I actually have a little washer right there because this spacer is actually compressed over time since I've bolted it on and taken it off several times. And I think the bottom might have melted just a little bit during the 3D printing process. So this spacer is kind of a prototype, and it's definitely not exactly 50 millimeters any longer. Adding these little washers is what added the length to make it exactly 50 millimeters. So 50 millimeters is definitely still that number that you want to space your starter away from the back of your block to get that little starter wheel to kick out and to engage with that flywheel right here. And the way I have this thing set up is I have one of these jump packs right here. These little jump packs basically come with a positive and a negative. So you put the positive to the main terminal right here of the starter, and then you put the ground, the negative side of this little jump pack, over here to one of the bolts. And putting it to the bottom bolt is a little bit easier and out of the way. So that's the jump pack. But then you still have to actually engage the starter. The starter is not going to just turn on when you have the jump pack connected to this main bolt up here and to the bottom bolt for the ground. You actually have to trigger the starter by jumping this little tab right here that's on the bottom of that starter to the main positive tab right here. And for that, I use one of these little starter triggers. This is a little remote starter trigger you actually can get on Amazon or any auto parts store. But I like these OTC brand ones that I got on Amazon. You can actually get this on my Amazon page as well. All of it's listed there. These OTC ones are real nice because they have this little light right here. Actually, watch, I'll flip this on. Turn it from off to on my power pack, and you'll see that little light just went to on. So now the light basically indicates that the power is going through the device. And when you hit this button, this little trigger is gonna bridge the gap between this little prong and the main power post. So that's how this whole system works. So the minute I hit this sucker, you're gonna see this sucker turn over. But there's also the compression gauge. So the compression gauge is actually screwed into the cylinders, and that actually will tell you exactly how much compression you're making when you turn the cylinders over with the starter. So I've got a compression gauge right here. This is another OTC brand product. As you guys can see, I really like OTC. They have really high quality products, and this compression kit is also available on my Amazon store. So check it out, guys, because OTC makes really good stuff. Okay, so this is cylinder number 4. Remember, cylinder number 4 on my car is the one that wasn't holding any compression on my US domestic model EJ205. 3, 2, 1. About 200 PSI. Now this is a JDM engine, and they actually make a little bit more PSI because they have a little bit higher compression. But I'll tell you guys right now, it's a really good valve and ring seal. And you guys can actually watch this compression tester, and you can see the leakage. Basically, you can see how slow that needle is slowly dropping. That gives you an idea of what percentage leakage you have in that cylinder. So before you even do a leakage test, you can see right here that the leakage is very minimal, and this is definitely well below 10%. I'd even say this is less than 5% leakage. It's a really good, quick indication of your leakage, just watching that compression tester gauge. So this is my basic setup for running compression tests while my engine is on the engine stand. And I recommend you guys do this anytime you buy a used engine and anytime you have the opportunity to test that engine before you put it in the car. Because if I would have done this with my EJ205 before I put it in my car, I definitely would have found that cylinder number 4 had low compression. And this is a good idea anytime you buy a used engine from something like Facebook or Craigslist, or if you got a JDM engine from one of those importers. Take the time to put a starter on that engine and run a compression test, because it's always a good idea to know the condition of that engine before you move any further. I've actually tested all the cylinders in this JDM engine, and all the cylinders in this engine actually have between 165 PSI and about 200 PSI, which is really good, and I'm really happy with this engine. Even though it looks kind of dirty and cruddy on the outside, having those good compression numbers is basically a good indication this engine probably only has about 55 or 60,000 miles, which is typical for most JDM engines. Now, if you guys have any questions about this setup, go ahead and leave them in the comment section. I'll be sure to get back to you guys. Also, if you guys want to get one of these jump packs or this compression tester so you guys can do the same setup for your engine and run these compression tests on the engine stand, I'll have links to both of these items in my Amazon store. So check out the description below and I'll have links to both of these items. Alright guys, thanks a lot for checking out the video. I really appreciate it. My name's Luke. You guys are watching the Subaru Only channel. And until next time guys, later!